Good morning.
Good morning.
All's good with God around you?
Yes.
Yeah. Today I wanted to talk about false evidence appearing real.
Fear.
False evidence appearing real. Anybody experience any of that? See that in your life? I have. I've let fear get in my way. How about you? Out of worry, I don't see the facts. Out of something imagined, it's not real. Out of a lie, it's not truth, this fear stuff. Speaking of agape, I was there Wednesday. I went to see Reverend Bishop Carlton Pearson speak. Do you know this story about Bishop Carlton Pearson? He was a huge Pentecostal minister. Big, huge church in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was part of Oral Roberts tradition. And there's a movie about it on Netflix called Come Sunday. I don't want to give too much away, but what happened was he realized that some of the stuff he'd been teaching was not correct. And that had to do with this whole hell thing, that if you don't, if you're not saved, as they call what they do when you bring Jesus into your heart, etc., that you will go to hell. And he realized that that's not true, and that's not what the New Testament teaches. Oh, it was a big scandal. Huge scandal. I think this happened like 15 years ago. Huge scandal. He lost his church. Everybody walked out. He lost the way his income was gone. Nobody liked him anymore. It was just hell on earth. And he's been rebuilding, and he calls himself not a Pentecostal minister, but a Metacostal minister, as in metaphysics, because he's been studying metaphysics as he started moving, not necessarily away from the Pentecostal, but away from some of the things they taught. And he was at Agape on Wednesday speaking, and something he reminded me of was that fear is the opposite of faith. So when we are in fear, when we are in that whirlwind of false evidence appearing real, whether it is out of worry or something we've made up in our head or something we were taught and we still believe, or just some lie we keep telling ourselves, our faith in this philosophy becomes dim. And this happens to me too. So you don't have to feel bad when that shows up. Now, back when cartographers believed that the earth was flat, now, this wasn't the Middle Ages, because most people who were educated didn't believe the earth was flat in the Middle Ages, like we've been taught with Columbus and all that stuff, but, there's a lot of lies about Columbus that we were taught. But in about 2000 BC and up to about 500 BC, when people really believed the earth was flat, cartographers, map makers, would draw the edge of the earth. Have you seen any of those maps? We probably taught that when they were teaching us Columbus. And beyond the edge, they would usually write, "Here there be dragons." And sometimes there'd be little pictures under the ocean of dragons just like waiting, for your ship. So I was thinking about that when I remembered that, and I thought to myself, do I have an edge where the dragons live?
Wow.
In my thinking? Does fear, lack, and limitation show up and hold me back to some made-up boundaries that I've learned or accepted? When that happens, I've realized that my whole perspective of life reeks of that whole idea that there are dragons down here. And when I reach over here,
It's over.
I'm engulfed by the dragons. And not only does my perspective on life reek of it, but my experiences are filtered through it, because the law is just listening. The law of cause and effects is going, oh, okay, you have the perspective that there's a boogeyman somewhere. And so when you reach that edge, the boogeyman's going to show up, so I'm going to filter all your experiences through that, okay? Because I say yes to everything. And our personality, oh, that's when it really gets ugly. Our personality starts out picturing this edge where the dragons are. And we're grumpy all the time, and nothing's good enough. You ever feel that way sometimes? It's okay to feel that way sometimes. Things happen. Things show up. I saw this TED Talk. This woman, her name is Ingrid Betancourt. And in 2002, she was campaigning to become the president of Colombia. Pretty cool. But then she was kidnapped by guerrillas. Like army guerrillas, not like... Although that would make an interesting story. She was kidnapped by guerrillas and held captive in the jungle for 6 years.
Wow.
Whoa. Now, fear, of course, at that time was her constant companion for many reasons. Am I going to get home ever? What are they going to do? Are they going to lock me up? Or worse. But she learned to grow with it instead of let it get her totally incapacitated. And she realized this. Obviously, she said, fear is contagious, but faith is too. Faith isn't rational or emotional. Faith is an exercise of the will. It is the discipline of the will. It's what allows us to transform everything that we are, our weaknesses and our frailties, into strength and power. It's truly a transformation. It's what gives us strength to stand up in the face of fear, look above it, and see beyond it. I know we all need to connect with that strength we have inside of us during the times when there's a storm raging around our boat. Storms raging around our boat. Anybody have any storms raging around your boat? In health, in money, in relationships, in your creative or work life? It's interesting through spiritual practice, because we're always taught, you do spiritual practice and then the faith will come back to you. But when you're here and you're believing that there's this edge where the dragons live as you go over it, your spiritual practice can also entice your fear. Because if you live in a woe is me kind of attitude, your spiritual practice can also enhance that woe is me if you're not intentional about what you're doing. And intentional about being in faith of this philosophy that says that God is within you and you have the power and the choice to be heaven on earth. Not just live out heaven on earth, but be heaven. Ernest Holmes said, the secret of prayer and its power in the outward life depends upon an unconditional faith in and reliance upon this inner presence. So we can live in it, soak in it, drown in it, or step through it. And I'm talking about fear. And fear could be huge, or fear could be just a little thing. That little thing that stops you from coming home here on a Sunday, stops you from going to the movies by yourself. Having a nice lunch in a restaurant by yourself. Little things like that, not just the big things. So we can live in that fear, we can soak in that fear, and we can drown in it, or we can step through it. We can stare at it and become incapacitated by it, or stare it down and go past this edge. I want to tell you a story about John Newton. Most people don't know who John Newton is. He was born in 1725. He was nurtured by a Christian mother who taught him the Bible at an early age. But when he was 7 years old, she passed away. She died of tuberculosis. And then he was raised by his sea captain father, who was very stern. At age 11, such fun things people did in the 1700s. At age 11, he went on his first of 6 sea voyages with a merchant navy captain. But soon he lost that job because, he's 11 years old, because, and this is his quotes, unsettled behavior and impatience of restraint is what he, but who hasn't had that in our lives? A little bit of unsettled behavior and impatience of restraint. I think I had a little last night myself. Now this pattern of being kind of a rowdy kid kept going and going and going. And now we're in 1744, and he's been forced to enlist aboard this ship called the HMS Harwich. Hated it. He hated every bit of it. He didn't like this life. He didn't like the people. He rebelled against the discipline of the Royal Navy, and so he deserted. He got off the ship somewhere and he deserted. But then he got caught, and they put him in irons, and as they would do in the 1700s, they flogged him. Now, eventually, he convinced his superiors to discharge him, and they put him on a slaver ship. Not as a slave, but as a worker. Now, in this part of the story, he describes himself as arrogant and insubordinate, as I described him earlier, and living with moral abandon. He said, I sinned with a high hand, and I made it my study to tempt and seduce others. Teenagers. Then Newton took up with employment with a slave trader named Clow. Now, Clow owned a plantation of lemon trees on an island off of West Africa. Now, he was treated really cruelly by Clow and Clow's African mistress. They beat him, and it was horrible. And so soon, his clothes turned to rags, and he was forced to beg for food. The guy has a job, but he can't get new clothes, and he's being beaten all the time. Now he has to beg for food. They don't even give him food. So then we jump to 1747, and he was transferred to the service of the captain of the Greyhound, a Liverpool ship. Now we're getting close to the part of the story I really want you to know. I just want you to see that this kid was not a good kid, no matter how he was brought up, and his life was just sucky. So he's on this Liverpool ship, and they're going home. They're on their journey to home, and the ship was overtaken by an enormous storm. So the Greyhound had been thrashing about in the North Atlantic Sea for over a week. Imagine that. You're on a ship for a week in a storm. Splashing about, just coming back on a sail ship for me after about 3 hours on a sailboat going to from the marina to Malibu and back a few months ago on my birthday. And that last hour was like, maybe this is, and it was a calm day. Maybe I shouldn't have eaten that. Anyway, so but this is a week of a storm, so he's thrashing about. So the canvas sails were ripped. The wood on one side of the ship had been torn away and splintered. The sailors had little hope of survival, but they kept working those pumps and trying to keep the vessel afloat. On the 11th day of the storm, John Newton was just too exhausted to help with the pump, so they tied him to the helm for 12 hours, and his job was to, hold the course, because he's tied to the steering wheel, so to speak. So with the storm raging fiercely, Newton had time to think. I love this story. His life seemed as ruined and wrecked as the battered ship he was trying to steer. Since the age of 11, he had lived a life at sea in his his reputation for profanity, coarseness, and debauchery even shocked many a sailor. In his contemplation, remember he's tied to the wind and the rain and everything. In his contemplation, in the midst of this raging storm, both outward and within, so we have a storm raging within, equaling the storm out here, Newton remembered his mother's teaching of Proverbs 1:24 through 31. And it goes like this, if you don't happen to remember this, Proverbs. Because I have called, and you have refused to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded, because you have ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I also laughed at your calamity. I will mock when calamity overtakes you, when your fear shows up as a desolation and your destruction shows up as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Then you shall call upon me, but I will not answer. You will seek me diligently, but will not find me. Since you hated knowledge, would have none of my counsel, and despised all my reproof, you shall eat the fruit of your way, and be filled with the fruit of your beliefs. Now, a lot of that is, the mean, fearful God stuff. But listen to the last part. Since you hated knowledge, would have none of my counsel, would not commune with the divine within, and despised all my reproof, meaning the little words you hear that comes from the divine that tells you, don't go that way, why don't you go this way? And you go, no, I'm smarter, and you go the other way. You shall eat the fruit of your way and be filled with the fruit of your beliefs, because the law listens to your beliefs. So if you're here and you know there's dragons here and believe there's dragons here, the law's going to say, okay, I'll bring you dragons. So his disconnect with love, peace, grace, and wisdom brought him hate, self-disgust, and ignorance, and this hard life, especially now that he's tied for hours and hours with this storm coming at him onto the boat there. So Newton imagined the universe laughing and mocking him, and he was in that woe is me attitude, perspective. Though he waited, like many of us do, till he was in deep waters, inwardly and outwardly, it was at that moment that he reconnected to who he really was, who he really was to the divine within. Did you ever have that where you wait until you hit bottom? I know there's some places that teach that you gotta hit bottom in order to come back up. You know what I say to that? If you believe that, great. And when you get there, then you know, wow, I'm here, so I'm coming up. That's great, but you don't have to get there. So though Newton continued in his profession of sailing and slave trading for a time, his life was transformed as he remembered this Bible quote. And he began a disciplined spiritual practice that led him at the age of 39 to become an ordained Christian minister. Now he quickly became disgusted with the slave trade that he was a part of and his role in it. He said, "A business in which my heart now shudders," and he worked with others to abolish that, although it did take a couple of decades for that to happen. Now let me get to the point of why I bring him up. On Sunday services, Newton often composed a hymn which developed the talk for the evening. So he'd write a hymn every week or so, and it was part of the talk, and the choir would sing it, or he would sing it. 280 of them were collected and combined with 68 others by another gentleman, friend of his, William Copper, and published as the Olney Hymns. And some of you who might have been brought up in the Christian faith probably have heard many of these Olney hymns. The most famous of all the Olney hymns originally was called, this is a great title, and since it's from the 1700s, you could probably reuse this if you write a song that would match this title, Faith's Review and Expectation. Isn't that a great title? Faith's Review and Expectation. Funnily enough, this song has been recorded by Diana Ross, Judy Collins, the Celtic Women, the Three Tenors sang it, Alan Jackson for country folks sang it, Steve Tyler sang it with Aerosmith. That would be an interesting version. Whitney sang it, Elvis sang it, Aretha sang it, Mahalia, of course, sang it. It's been heard in the movies, and I know you've all seen the movie Tommy Boy, haven't you? And Silkwood, it was in Silkwood, and it was in one of my favorite movies, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. You didn't know. And this was the song. Maybe you recognize this. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Now, we don't use that word wretch usually in the New Thought world. When New Thoughters sing this song, they change the words. And they usually say, a soul like me, instead of using the word wretch. But I want you to understand, because sometimes I go back to these old songs and these old beliefs, and I want to see where they really came from. Now, as most of you know, I was brought up in the Jewish religion, so Amazing Grace was not, a big song at our services, but I was reading about Amazing Grace, and it's such a beautiful song, and I was looking at the words and saying, well, what's behind these words? Because I know when they sing it in the Christian faith, what they mean by it, but what's it really mean? So I wanted to understand what John Newton was going through when he wrote this, what he was talking about. And I realized, after reading this whole big story that I told you about, that he was acknowledging his journey to getting back to God within. He might not have used those terms. That it was his willingness to surrender to the divine and admit to the horrors of his beliefs and actions from the past. But he avoided that spiritual bypass of a soul like me and acknowledged that at that time he was a wretch.
Yep.
Now, we may not use the word wretch, and we may not do as horrible things or be as horrible as John Newton was when he was younger, but we use similar terms with the same feelings. Words like unfortunate, things like that don't happen in our family. I am unhappy, I am poor, despicable, I am in despair, I'm a loser, I'm a loafer, I'm a coward. Anything that is that woe is me attitude waiting for the dragons to show up. We just use a different term. We don't use the term wretch. Wretch is actually kind of an old term. We don't use that word much anymore anyway. But we use other words that you might as well have said wretch. So let's not sugarcoat any of this, but know the true meaning of the word and the song. When we step into the divine consciously with spiritual practice using our faith, we are consciously connecting with joy, right? Because if you've heard me talk, you know that to me the word joy means your connection with the divine versus the word happy. Happy is an experience. Joy is a belief and a state of being versus a state of mind. You get that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So when we live with this information from joy coming in, with the knowledge that we live in that illumination of the divine origin that we are, answers show up. Answers come. Wisdom comes. So that we don't have to ask why. Why isn't it here? Whatever it is we're waiting for. Why? When is it coming? Whatever it is we're waiting for. Our vitality and vibrancy to return. Our relationships to get where they were or to be better, period. We not only know the truth, but we start living the truth. We make statements, declarations, and reveal the passion within our heart when we step back into our faith, which will overpower then our fear. And if those moments come when we feel limitation and lack is rampant, that's okay. Sometimes they show up. Things from what we were taught before, get triggered. We may feel hesitation or time is against us. We may feed on some sort of shame or blame or guilt. But when we use this affirmation, amazing grace, how sweet the sound, we become illuminated by the divine within us.
Yes.
And I'm not only talking about this with some knowledge, but I'm talking about this with experience. It is a reminder, it is an intentional, conscious reconnection that allows us to step out past what we think are dragons there, or false evidence appearing real, and transform our faith, our fear into faith, returning a passion for life. So that when we hear this song, it reconnects us to the divine if we are a little off. It's an affirmation, not just a beautiful piece of beautiful music. So we hear, amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Amazing grace, God, the Big Bang, the spiritual presence, the divine intelligence that saved a wretch like me, that came to me, that I allowed, that I opened my heart, my mind, my imagination and intuition to that amazing grace, to that divine presence, to inform me or re-inform me if I need to be re-informed who and what I am, and the power that I have and the choices that I always have in faith.
Yes.
And we know that I once was lost, but now I am found, because we have reconnected, was blind with all that fear, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. Yes, grace was there because God is love, is all love, is unconditional love. So if you want to feel fear in your life, God loves you and will allow you to sit in fear and stew in it if you want. Because the law always says yes. So if you want to stew in fear, if you want to have dragons there waiting for you, God says, okay, but I love you. And if you open your heart and you realize who you are, which is me within you,
Yes.
the power of the universe that made all the stars and the trees and the wood and the planets. If you know that is within you, that same grace is going to bring you out of that fear and relieve you of that fear. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. My friends, remember your faith and have no fear.
Yes.
The law, God, everything, the power of the universe, Ringo, George, whatever you want to call it, is here for you to make the choice to stay in faith and not fear the dragons, no matter where they came from.
Yes.
Can I get an amen?
Amen.
That's right. So let's all take a deep breath together. Let's know, and this is an affirmation I use. When I breathe in, when I need, and it's been recent that I've needed this, that I've required it in my life, I take a deep breath in and I know God is, right?
Yes.
God is. And then when I exhale, I know I am. Because if you believe in the Bible, in any sort of way, I am that I am. You are that I am. God is within. God is there waiting. It will wait forever because it is unconditional love. So let's know together that this unconditional love is within each and every one of us. And we, each and every one of us, are now making that choice to stay in faith. No matter what is going on in life, no matter who we think is in our way, even if it's us, no matter what we think it is in our way, even if it's us, we step into the divine which we are. We know who we are. And we know inside every choice we make is love only. Because God is unconditional in its love. It speaks unconditionally in its love. And when we take the moment, as we are right now, to soak in the amazing grace of the divine intelligence within, we soak in this love of prosperity. We soak in this love of vibrant and vital health. All these organs in our bodies working at optimal levels. The blood flowing easily. Our body full of oxygen. We know in every one of our relationships, whether they're romantic, business, family, or friends, that there is love there, there is mutual respect there. There is the knowing, even if those people don't think in these terms, there is the knowing and the anointing of the divine, of that amazing grace within each and every one of them, so that the relationship is love, is respect. We know this in our creative life and our work life. That the divine grace, that amazing grace is there so that the choices we made are fun, fulfilling, soul-feeding, come from that intuition, that imagination in our gut that brings happiness and joy and creativity in our life at home and at work. And of course, we know this in our pocketbook. This prosperity, of course, is abundant in our pocketbook. And we step into the amazing grace. And if there's some fear there from some stupid stuff we learned, bye-bye, it's gone. Because we've stepped over the edge and we know there's nothing there but more water to let us float in amazing grace to the prosperity that is our birthright. So each and every one of us now has stepped into that prosperity, stepped into that vitality, stepped into that creativeness, stepped into those loving relationships, and are soaking in the amazing grace that is our birthright, that we're born with, that we can have at every moment of every day. And we declare this and affirm this and step into this and allow it to surround us and illuminate us. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. Take a breath in. God is. Hold it. Hold that God in you. Yes. And you can release it because it doesn't go anywhere, because I am. God is. So knowing this, affirming this, declaring this, revealing this now and forevermore, we can stand grateful, thankful, knowing, appreciative, living this life. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. God is. I am. Feel it. Enjoy it. It is you. And together we say, and so it is. Amen. Namaste, everyone. Thank you so much.